Hi everyone, Bill Reynolds here, your City Administrator. We wanted to take some time today to walk you through our payment processing system. Darren, what is our system and when did we first establish it and why?
Well, thank you, Mr. Reynolds. We implemented a tungsten workflow process this past summer. Back in July of 2017, we went live. And part of that process is that it's an automated process that actually we integrate our purchasing policy right into our purchasing procedures, basically. And so as we were going through and implementing that tungsten workflow process, we took the time as well to look at our purchasing policy that hadn't been reviewed in a number of years and made some updates to that and made some good changes to make sure that we have solid internal controls in place and that we could better actually implement those internal controls right into the tungsten workflow process.
And this particular process gives your department, as the finance director, multiple eyes on any one particular receipt or document, correct?
Oh, absolutely. As our purchasing policy lays out, depending upon the dollar value of the invoice, we will have upwards of at least 2 people will touch it, and actually 3 people will touch it by the time it reroutes back into finance, but upwards of 4 or 5 people by the time everything is said and done on an invoice. So,
one of the interesting things that you touched on was the fact that we have melded our purchasing policy with our actual purchasing system. And that what we've done is integrate that to where our policy really is the process and vice versa. How important is that?
It's very important. You can always have a policy, but if you don't follow the policy, it's as good as the words that are written on the piece of paper. So having that policy in place ensures strong internal controls, but foremost is actually implementing those internal controls, and that's what this tungsten system has allowed us to do, is that we're actually able to program in the controls of that policy that ensures that every time an invoice comes through, it's following the exact process that has been set up in place, so that we have consistency among employees and they know exactly what is required to process up an invoice through the system.
So what we're going to do now is walk you through an invoice as it comes through the process. Hello everyone, we're starting at the beginning of our process for the tungsten system, and Darren is going to help us explain exactly what it is we're seeing. This is the first set of eyes that we have on this particular invoice. Darren?
Thank you. To begin our tungsten workflow process, we receive all of our invoices, all the original invoices, into our finance department. That's part of the control process that ensures that we've received the original invoice either via mail or email from the vendor up here at the finance department. We are with Karen Macklin, our accounts payable clerk, that handles the initial kickoff of our tungsten workflow process. She's responsible for gathering all those invoices and then entering them into the system and ensuring that a lot of our other information in there is correct. Karen can go into the details specifically of what she does on her end.
Sure, thank you, Darren. What we do is called validation. When an invoice is either mailed in or emailed into the city, I have the responsibility of going through adding the vendor name, the invoice number, the invoice date, the dollar amount, and from that point, double checking to make sure that everything is okay on it, no sales tax, and everything else looks fine. From that point, I need to then make the determination as to who I will route it to do the geocoding part of the process. Once the geocoding part is finished, I approve it so that it goes on to that person, and then it goes into their inbox in their geocoding approval.
We are now going to start working through our tungsten approval workflow process. We are in Andy Hudson's office here, our IT manager, and he's going to work through one of the approvals for one of our Logis invoices for our server upgrades that we've recently implemented this past fall and winter here now. So off to Andy for working through that approval process.
Okay, so I've received a notification in my email that I do have a tungsten workflow item, and it happens to be for a server SAN project that was approved back in October. So what I need to do is log into Tungsten. And I can see within Tungsten that I do have several invoices. I do have 4 invoices, and I can see that I do have one from Logis, which is the one that we're going to show you today. So I can open up and view the invoice that came in through the finance department, and I can see in this one that I do have multiple items. Not only do I have the project for the server SAN replacement, but I also have some licensing that I also need to pay, so I need to pay 2 separate charges on that and apply that to 2 separate GL codes. So what I can do is I select my line item that I want to work on, but I do also need to attach the approval to that for the project, which was approved by the City Council again back in October. So what I do there is I click on the PID number and I need to add. So I click add a new document, and on my desktop I do have a Logis Council memo. So I pulled that from the council memo, which I gave to City Council, and I attach that, and I add that as council approval, and insert that into my line item.
And maybe we should take a step back, Andy, and talk about why we're attaching the council approval to this item. This was a larger project that was over that or $25,000 purchasing threshold for, which is one of the thresholds within our purchasing policy.
That's
And
correct.
anything above that purchasing threshold of $25,000 needs to have council approval beforehand. So that's just ensuring that when we go through and approve this document or this invoice, that we have received that council approval on the front end.
That is correct. So now you can see I have not only the invoice in there, but I also have the council approved memo attached to my purchase. So now I can actually GL code that. So if I click on GL code, so now I can see on my screen here that I'm looking at an account number that it just defaults to 999. So I have to pick my IT fund where this purchase came out of. You can see that this is the first invoice for a project of $96,000. Total project is going to be over $200,000. So this is just the first invoice that came in from Logis. So my first one I punch in is for the project. So that's 7806-6740. And it's actually not for the full dollar amount, because I showed before that I do have some separate charges on there for some licensing. So this one comes up to $93,998 and 82 cents. And explanation is a server SAN replacement project. And this is a limited character field, so I can't put a long description. So now you can see I have a remaining balance of $2,234, and that is the exact dollar amount that I have left for my Adobe licensing for next year. So I have to change my code to 6410, add that, and now I can see my invoice is balanced at 0. So all my items that I have within this project are within that area right there.
So the Tungsten workflow system is built with controls in place that says that invoice total, it knows what the total invoice is, and it has to distribute that entire invoice amount out to different areas. So if Andy would have stopped after the first step, it would have aired out and not allowed him to go any further beyond this point.
Okay, so now I can hit save and next. And you can see on my screen the distributed amount equals my invoice amount. And I can go ahead and hit done.
And you notice there that no errors popped up when Andy hit done. With an invoice that large, that was $96,000 invoice or so, there are controls built into the system that says, okay, if it's above $25,000, something else needs to happen because we need to have that council approval. Well, Andy's first step was to attach that council approval memo. Well, if he wouldn't have done that, the system would have stopped him at that point and said, hey, we have an error, something's not attached because something isn't lining up with what the parameters have been designed or implemented into the system, which all goes back to what our purchasing policy is as well. So the system's designed to mirror what our purchasing policy is. So at this point, Andy is done with his coding process, and now we'll move on to his supervisor, which would be Nate Burkett, our Assistant City Administrator. Welcome back. We are now with Nate Burkett, the Assistant City Administrator, and working with our second step in the approval process of that first invoice that we're looking at with the Logis invoice from Andy Hudson, our IT manager. Nate will now sign into our system and look at and review the invoice and make sure that all the supporting documentation is attached, and make sure that we have budget allotment for it, make sure that everything looks accordingly to his satisfactory as well too. So, welcome, Nate.
Thanks, Darren. I'm going to log into Tungsten with my unique password. go into the workflow, and as you can see on the left side here, I have an invoice for approval from Andy Hudson in the amount of $96,232 for Logis. And what I do is I'll typically click on the link to take a look at the invoice and make sure I feel as though it's appropriate. And because it is over $25,000, I'm going to look to this tab up here for council approval. I'm going to see that it's approved by council. Approve and done.
And the nice thing about our tungsten workflow process is that it has an audit trail for every step in the process, from when it was kicked off within the finance department to now Andy Hudson and now on to Nate Burkett. And since this is a larger invoice over that $25,000 threshold, it is actually going to go on to our city administrator for his approval as well. That's another piece of our purchasing policy that we've implemented within the tungsten workflow system. So through all those steps, all that audit trail is always being documented, and we can tell exactly when it arrived, when it was approved, and when it left Nate's desk to go on to the next step for the approval process, or on to finance for finance review.
Hello everyone, Bill Reynolds, City Administrator again. It's now my turn to have my fingers on this particular product. Just to recap, at this point we've had Andy Hudson do the coding, we've had Nate Burkett do the initial approval, now I will be doing the final approval because this item is over $25,000, and per our policy and per the tungsten process, that requires my fingers on it as well and my approval. So with that being said, we've already logged in, and I'm going to go directly to the item in question. I'm going to take a look at this particular piece. It's city manager approval. As you can see here, we've got the item. The first thing I'm going to do is to take a look, much like Nate did. I'm going to take a look at the actual documentation to once again have another set of eyes on this. Darren, at this point, this particular invoice has had, including your finance department, has had how many sets of eyes on it?
It would have had the initial finance, would have sent out the invoice originally, would have went to Andy Hudson as the initial GL coder, Nate Burkett as the direct supervisor of that, and then on to the city administrator. So it would have had at least 4 touches to this point. At
this point, so on the 4th touch to this, I'm going to look through this, like I said, doing much the same thing that Nate has done. For me, I specifically look at this particular item here on each one of these documents, because these are the voucher audited for payment. That means that gives me some comfort level that these have all been touched and looked at. And everything appears to be in order. I would spend more time on this, frankly, if we weren't looking at time for this particular video. I'm looking at the invoice amount, which did also reflect the previous amount. And I just want to check one more thing, the council approval. This is the memo that Andy had originally written to the council on October 17th. I'm reviewing that, making sure that once again that everything is in order there. I'm comfortable at this point that this is good. I'm going to hit select and approve. And this is, other than finance, the final piece of this particular item. And at this point, it'll go into the finance final approval authority.
We are now back with Karen, who we started the process with. We've kind of made full circle of that invoice, of those invoices coming through the approval process. Karen now will review the invoices and do a final check to verify that everything is accurate and that there isn't any other issues with the invoice, and that all appropriate documentation is attached. And Karen, you can explain that process a little better than I can.
Sure, Darren. Once everything has been approved and it has been through the system, it comes into the finance review box. At that time, that is the last option before it goes on to our JDE system, which then will generate the checks. We go through that process by me opening up each individual review. I look to make sure that we have the appropriate attachments to it. The names and everything else are still valid. The dollar amounts and all of the paperwork line up to everything that attaches to that invoice. Once that is done, it then goes off into our JDE system for it then to be processed as a payment.
So guys, help me understand what the difference is between this type of a purchase, which is a large major purchase that has went through the process and is approved by council, and let's say a purchase card, our city credit cards. What's the difference?
Well, the main difference is that it's a different type of transaction. A P card, we have the system set up to recognize that it's a P card. It requires the documentation, the detailed receipt of that transaction to be attached to it, similar to how we attach the council memo. But it's going to identify itself as a P card transaction. We get a statement at the end of each month from our credit card company listing all of those transactions. Karen then takes that credit card statement and it magically goes out to every P card holder, and then they are responsible for attaching their P card receipt that they receive from the store or online or whatnot on that end of it. But really, the process mirrors our purchasing policies. That the process is pretty much the same. It just identifies this as a P card transaction versus a regular invoice.
Karen, what happens if we don't have an invoice, a documentation? What's your role at that point?
If some attachment is not the correct one, I have the option to reject it and send it back to that person with a note that is documented on there for them to see, saying that this is the wrong backup or more backup is required in order for this to be approved.
And you will not approve anything absent that backup?
Correct.
Right. And the nice thing about our system, as we mentioned earlier, is that it has that auto tracking feature on there, so we can see every one of those steps. So if Karen rejects it, we'll know exactly the time and date that it was rejected, who it went back to, and when they then corrected their issues and came back to finance review.
And that's our process, ladies and gentlemen. Both Darren and I take our jobs very seriously. We want to make sure that we are good stewards of your tax dollars. I've often said that, since we take your money in a transaction, it's not a voluntary transaction, we have a higher moral responsibility to make sure that we use those funds wisely and that we also are accountable for the use of those funds. Darren, we've walked them through the system at this point. When you think about our particular system and some of the, we've both been in different venues in the past, different organizations, what's your level of comfort with what we currently have in place?
So my level of comfort with our system is a lot different than with other organizations I've been with. Having implemented this tungsten workflow process, it really has incorporated, there's no more of that, obviously there's always a human factor to it, but it's taken out some of that decision-making processes that we always have to have the appropriate approval levels done for dependent upon the amount of the invoice and such like that. So it really has strengthened those internal controls. As a finance director, we're always looking to improve upon internal controls and always kind of taking a watchful look at things. But as far as our systems are concerned, I have great comfort in knowing that we have a good procedures and process in place.
And I'll tell you, as a city administrator, I have a great comfort as well. If for no other reason, is that we have multiple sets of eyes, as we've shown you, that look at the same document and have to basically sign off on everything that comes through. It's not just one, it's not just two, sometimes it's not even just three, it's 4 or 5 different people depending on that level of a particular invoice. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and we look forward to serving you in the future.